Hello, I am Professor Eric Martin, and I cannot imagine that you are watching this video unless you are in my World History 102 course. And what I want to do in today's short video is I want to sum up what we have done at the conceptual level so far and introduce this week's chapter and materials in the hopes that it produces an easier discussion for y'all to go into more depth with the materials. So, the very first chapter we dealt with, chapter 15 in Worlds of History, we were comparing the overseas expansion of Europe, particularly the Spanish, and of the Ming Chinese. And I think that y'all did a really good job of laying out the basic characteristics of each set of circumstances in terms of comparative history. So y'all go back to the discussion boards, take a look at that. I was happy with what you did. But at the conceptual level, what we were doing that week is we were developing our ability to distinguish between primary and secondary sources. And that is a key thinking ability that historians require. That's a key thinking ability that you need for this course. You need to be able to identify, is it a secondary or is it a primary source as soon as you take a look at it. That particular chapter started with the secondary source, ended with the secondary source, and had three primary sources sandwiched in between. Keeping in mind, right, primary sources, that's from the material under the time of study, eyewitness accounts. Secondary sources, that's what people like myself write based on the primary sources. But we need to work on distinguishing, and we need to work on learning how to use them. In fact, we need to work on learning how to use them, and therefore, when we went through chapter 16, so that was last week's material, it was a very similar exercise. Our mission was to delve deeper into the primary sources and delve deeper into trying to figure out what the primary sources tell us and how to read them. Now, the last week, it was all primary sources in the documents. And then y'all's mission on the discussion boards were to come up with some kind of conclusions concerning the attitudes that Europeans demonstrated towards Africans, the attitudes Africans demonstrated towards Europeans, attitudes that Europeans demonstrated towards Native Americans, and attitudes Native Americans demonstrated towards Europeans, and in some case Europeans really meant Spanish in this particular case, and in other cases we were looking particularly at the English, and that's that's an important skill for us to develop. On one hand, it's kind of an interesting idea in general historically. How do we document an attitude, right? So you have to go through the sources with a certain mindset to get that, and then just try to figure out how people are viewing one another. The primary sources, that's not always the easiest read. So y'all be sure to give yourself enough time to engage in the primary sources in a meaningful way so that you're able to actually go through them and spend the time to read between the lines. Those are the building blocks of history. That's what we take to figure out, well, this is what was written in the past. Well, what do we really think this means? Anyway, that's what we did the last 2 weeks, really focusing on getting a better grasp of the basic building blocks of history, primary sources, the eyewitness accounts from the past, and secondary sources, the historical interpretations that historians write using the primary sources. This week, we skip ahead to chapter 19 in Worlds of History. That is not to say that chapters 17 and 18 are not important. A major part of the historian's job is figuring out what to leave out, especially in something like world history. I choose to move ahead on this for my own reasons. Well, we just can't get to everything. And I think that this issue of the scientific revolution is important. Not only in terms of understanding science and technology, which really seems to dominate our contemporary worldview, but also conceptually, thinking about what does it mean for a historian today to attribute a change in the past, to call that a revolution, revolutionary, the scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. That is not what people at the time were saying about it. That gets developed by people like myself. In fact, if I remember correctly, in terms of the scientific revolution, that term does not even really come into existence until the very beginning of the 20th century. People looking backwards come up with some sort of phrasing to conceptually categorize something that occurred in the past. So, but then there's these implications, right? What does the term revolution itself imply about what actually happened? Oh, you know, the obvious part of it is it implies it was quick. It was important. It was a major change. And it happened, you know, at some sort of a breakneck speed. And so the mission for this week is to read the documents and see if that's true. How revolutionary is the scientific revolution? And one way to measure how revolutionary the scientific revolution is how does the worldview of Europeans change as a result of the scientific revolution? Another way to measure it is what about the role that the scientific revolution plays on 50% of the population, women? How does the scientific revolution affect women? And then another way to measure the revolutionary aspect of it is to, okay, well, in terms of what's going on in the rest of the world, how different is it? And so the secondary sources in the chapter, this is exactly what happens. We got Jack Goldstone asking the question, why Europe? What is it about Europe that allows the kinds of changes that we associate with the scientific revolution to occur there? So make sure you understand what the basic characteristics are, what the basic changes are, and make sure you understand what Goldstone says is unique about Europe compared to other places in the world that allow things to happen there. However, we've got another secondary source by Anderson and Zisner, and they make an interesting argument about the role that the scientific revolution does or does not play in terms of the lives of women. So pay attention to that. There's a third secondary source in the readings for this week, done by Linda Noreen Schaefer. That is an important source in which she compares Europe's trajectory and the major changes that people typically associate with the scientific revolution to China. And she looks at the major technologies that that people say, well, this is, you know, what happened in Europe and this is what makes it revolutionary. And then she looks at how those technologies played themselves out in China. So pay careful attention to that one in terms of being able to get a sense about how different science is or how these technologies play themselves out on opposite ends of the world. In addition to these three secondary sources, we've got three primary sources this week. We've got this piece by Isaac Newton. That's classic. That gives us a really nice idea about sort of basic worldview. Here are kind of the changes that occur. We've got this other piece looking at smallpox inoculations. It's short. Think about the implications of it. Think about the implications of it. And then finally, We've got this piece on the a Dutch anatomy lesson in Japan. Same thing. It's not particularly long, but read through it. What's the story that is happening in that document, and what does it tell us about the role of science, in this particular case in Holland, versus the role of science in Japan? And the primary sources are designed to shed some kind of light on the major issue of the secondary sources. So the primary sources and each secondary source have some kind of a connection. They're not directly connected. Read those carefully. That ought to be the main materials that we discuss in our discussion boards. We'll see if this kind of video maybe helps a little bit with getting our discussion going. As usual, if you have any questions at all about the course, feel free to email me. Feel free to call me at the office. Feel free to drop by if my office door is open. Let's make sure that y'all are getting the most out of this history class that you can. And having said that, enjoy your historical studies and carry on.